The drone footage looked ordinary, until it wasn't. A recreational quadcopter glides over the rugged Colorado wilderness, its camera sweeping across endless pine forests that carpet the mountainsides. The footage is smooth, almost hypnotic, an amateur enthusiast capturing nature's majesty from above. Then something flashes in the corner of the frame. The drone operator adjusts his controls, curious. The camera pans, focuses, and reveals what 17 years of professional search teams could not: a metallic glint among the trees, unnatural angles reflecting sunlight where only organic shapes should exist. The coordinates match almost exactly to the last transmission from Flight 908B, missing since 2008. When Captain Daniel Reese vanished, everyone had a theory: a storm, a malfunction, perhaps a wrong turn in the labyrinth of mountain passes. But no one, absolutely no one, imagined what was actually waiting to be found. What had remained hidden beneath the canopy of trees wasn't just wreckage, it was evidence. Evidence that had been patiently waiting, preserved by isolation and altitude, telling a story that some had desperately tried to erase. Today we'll uncover the warning signs everyone missed, because the truth about Daniel's disappearance isn't just about a single flight. It's about how easy it is to lose sight of danger until it's too late. April 16, 2008 began like any other day in the Reese household: mundane, ordinary, forgettable. The kind of morning that should have dissolved into the background of memory, joining thousands of other unremarkable days. Instead, it became a dividing line in time, the moment when before and after were permanently etched into the family's existence. Emily Reese moved quietly around their modest kitchen in Boulder, Colorado, preparing coffee as the morning light spilled through east-facing windows. The forecast scrolling across her phone mentioned scattered high-altitude clouds, light turbulence, afternoon. Nothing that would concern her husband, a veteran pilot with over 15,000 flight hours. She glanced at the clock, 5:42 a.m. Daniel was already outside, loading his flight bag into the car. He wasn't supposed to fly that day, Emily would later tell investigators, her voice holding steady despite the pain behind her eyes. Someone called in sick, and he volunteered to take the route. A friendly favor. That favor, a last-minute flight from Denver to Spokane for Aerosky Logistics, would become the first in a cascade of warning signs that no one recognized until it was far too late. In the driveway, Daniel Reese triple-checked his flight plan while his 13-year-old daughter, Sophie, stood nearby, still in pajamas despite the early hour, unwilling to miss seeing her father off. "What time will you be back?" Sophie asked, hugging herself against the morning chill. Daniel smiled, the kind of easy, reassuring smile that had always made his family feel safe. "I'll be home for dinner. Promise." He kissed his wife, hugged his daughter one final time, and pulled out of the driveway in his silver Honda. The last image Emily and Sophie would have of him: a casual wave through the car window, his Aerosky Logistics cap pulled low over his eyes, protection against the rising sun. A promise to be home by dinner. A wave goodbye. A routine morning. None of them recognized these moments for what they were: the final threads of normalcy unraveling as Daniel drove toward Denver International Airport and the white Cessna 310 waiting on the tarmac. Later, much later, Emily would remember something that nagged at her consciousness that morning: how Daniel had seemed distracted during breakfast, checking his phone more than usual. "Everything okay?" she had asked. "Just some maintenance notes from yesterday's flight," he'd answered too quickly. "Nothing serious." Nothing serious. The phrase would haunt her for years. At 8:45 a.m., Daniel Reese's voice came over the radio for his pre-flight check with Denver Air Traffic Control. "Denver Tower, this is Aerosky Flight 908B, Cessna 310, requesting clearance for departure to Spokane." The controller's voice was clear, professional. "Aerosky 908B, Denver Tower, You're cleared for takeoff on runway 26. Roger that, Denver. 908B rolling. The white Cessna accelerated down the runway, lifting smoothly into the clear Colorado sky. Daniel banked northwest, climbing to his assigned cruising altitude of 19,000 feet. 28 minutes into the flight, at precisely 9:13 a.m., something happened that should have triggered immediate alarm but instead was logged as a common technical hiccup. Daniel's transponder signal disappeared from radar. In the Air Traffic Control Center, Controller Melissa Vance noted the dropout with a standard protocol marker, signal temporary. She expected it to reappear momentarily, a common occurrence in the mountains where terrain could briefly interrupt transmissions. It never did. What happened in those crucial minutes after 9:13 a.m. would remain unknown for 17 years. The search that followed found nothing. No wreckage, no emergency beacon signal, no conclusive evidence of what happened to Flight 908B or its pilot. Think of it like a heartbeat monitor going flat. The absence of sound is its own scream for help. But on that April morning in 2008, the silence was dismissed as technical interference. No immediate follow-up call was made. No alert was raised. When the transponder remained offline for 30 minutes, only then did controllers attempt radio contact. Aero Sky 908B, Denver Center, radio check over. Silence. Aero Sky 908B, Denver Center, please respond. More silence. By 10:30 a.m., nearly an hour after losing contact, emergency protocols were finally initiated. Too late. The white Cessna had vanished into the vast wilderness of the Rocky Mountains. What no one realized then was that the vanishing signal wasn't just a technical anomaly. It was the first warning. Sign in a pattern of negligence that would take nearly 2 decades to unravel. In the kitchen of their Boulder home, Emily Reese was marinating chicken for dinner when the phone rang at 2:17 p.m. She answered with hands still damp, expecting a call from her sister about weekend plans. Instead, a voice she didn't recognize asked if she was Mrs. Emily Reese, wife of Captain Daniel Reese. There's a particular way bad news arrives, a careful formality in the speaker's tone that signals disaster before the words themselves register. Emily felt her body respond before her mind understood, her fingers gripping the counter edge as the voice continued. Mrs. Reese, I'm calling from Aerosky Logistics. We've lost contact with your husband's flight. The chicken sat forgotten on the counter as Emily processed what she was hearing. Lost contact. Not crashed. Not missing. Just out of touch. Surely this was fixable, a technical problem, a matter of waiting for Daniel to land at some small airfield where reception was better. What exactly does that mean? She asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. The carefully measured response told her everything. We're implementing search and rescue protocols as a precaution. As a precaution. As though Daniel might still be flying somewhere beyond the reach of radio and radar, perfectly fine, but temporarily invisible to the systems designed to track him. Emily called Sophie's school immediately, asking them to send her daughter home. Then she sat at the kitchen table, staring at the phone, willing it to ring again with better news. It didn't. By nightfall, Colorado's Civil Air Patrol had launched search aircraft to comb the rugged terrain between Denver and the Idaho border. Local news ran the story as a developing situation. Pilot missing, search underway. Neighbors brought casseroles and concerned looks. Friends offered to stay the night. Everyone spoke in the present tense, careful to maintain the fiction that Daniel was simply delayed, temporarily lost, soon to be found. No one said what they were all thinking, that planes don't just disappear in 2008, not without catastrophic failure, not without explanation. As Emily lay awake that night, Sophie finally asleep in her arms after hours of tears, she remembered something Daniel had once told her about flying in the mountains. In bad situations, pilots don't die from the initial problem. They die from the cascade of decisions that follow. She didn't know it yet, but that insight would prove prophetic. Not just about flying, but about the corporate decisions that had put her husband's plane in the air that day. Dawn broke over the Rockies on April 17th, revealing a landscape both beautiful and brutal. Helicopter rotors beat against thin mountain air as search teams prepared for their second day of operations. The weather had turned overnight, clear skies replaced by low clouds that clung to the peaks like ghostly fingers. Visibility's down to half a mile in all some areas, reported search coordinator Captain Jeffries of the Civil Air Patrol. We're doing what we can, but these conditions... His voice trailed off. Everyone understood the implications. For 9 grueling days, search aircraft crisscrossed the mountains in expanding grid patterns. Ground teams hiked through forests and ravines, calling Daniel's name into the wilderness. Volunteer pilots from across Colorado joined the effort, flying their own planes low through dangerous terrain, risking their lives to find a colleague. On day 4, a momentary surge of hope, helicopter pilot Marcus Ellison spotted what appeared to be wreckage on a ridge near Greystone Peak. Rescuers scrambled to the site, only to discover the rusted remains of a weather station that had fallen decades earlier. On day 7, a search dog indicated interest near a forestry road 60 miles northwest of Denver. Teams excavated the area, finding nothing but old camping equipment abandoned years before. Each false lead drove the knife deeper for Emily and Sophie, who had set up a vigil at the Boulder Municipal Airport where updates came in hourly. Their lives had narrowed to a single purpose: waiting, hoping, praying for the miracle that grew more unlikely with each passing day. News coverage, initially prominent, began to wane. The story of the missing pilot was replaced by other tragedies, other concerns. Search resources, always limited, were gradually reduced as the likelihood of finding survivors diminished. On April 25th, 9 days after Daniel's disappearance, the official search was suspended. "We've exhausted all probable areas," the Civil Air Patrol's final report stated. "Weather and terrain challenges have made continued efforts prohibitively dangerous without new intelligence." Emily refused to accept this conclusion. Using their savings, she hired private aircraft to continue the search for another 2 weeks. Friends organized volunteer ground teams that combed accessible areas of the flight path throughout the summer. Nothing was found. No wreckage, no flight recorder, no sign of Daniel or his plane. It was as if Flight 908B had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind only questions that would haunt Emily and Sophie for years to come. The hardest part of any disappearance isn't the initial shock, it's what follows. The slow, grinding uncertainty that replaces the adrenaline of crisis. For Emily and Sophie Reese, the months after Daniel vanished became an exercise in learning to live with an unfinished sentence, a story without resolution. Emily returned to her job as a paramedic, functions on autopilot. Sophie struggled in school, her grades slipping as concentration became impossible. Their home in Boulder remained exactly as it had been on April 16th. Daniel's coffee mug still in the dishwasher, his reading glasses on the nightstand, his jacket hanging by the door. "I couldn't move his things," Emily would later explain. Moving them meant accepting. He wasn't coming back. But as summer faded into fall, another emotion began to replace grief's raw edge: suspicion. It started with a conversation at a memorial service organized by Daniel's fellow pilots. A mechanic Emily barely knew approached her after the ceremony, his expression guarded. "Mrs. Reese," he said quietly, "I'm really sorry about Dan. He was a good man, but there's something you should know." What followed was the first thread that, when pulled, would eventually unravel the carefully constructed narrative around Daniel's disappearance. According to the mechanic, Aero Sky Logistics had been cutting corners on maintenance for months. Budget constraints had led to shortcuts, extending service intervals, reusing parts that should have been replaced, signing off on inspections that hadn't been properly completed. Dan knew, the mechanic said. He'd filed reports, made noise about it. That's why they had him flying the older planes. Punishment routes. Emily listened, numb. The implications were too enormous to process immediately. Was he suggesting that Daniel's crash wasn't an accident, but the result of negligence? Or something even worse? I don't have proof, the mechanic admitted. Just what I've seen. But you deserve to know. He disappeared into the crowd before Emily could ask more questions, clearly afraid of being seen speaking to her. His fear told her more than his words had. That night, Emily pulled out the folder of documents Aerosky had provided after Daniel's disappearance. Maintenance logs, flight plans, company policies. She spread them across the dining room table, creating a makeshift investigation board that would remain there for years. Sophie found her mother there the next morning, red-eyed from a sleepless night, staring at papers she'd read a dozen times before. "Mom?" Sophie asked, her voice small in the morning quiet. "Did you find something?" Emily looked up, really seeing her daughter for the first time in months. Sophie had lost weight, her clothes hanging loosely on her frame. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, making her look far older than 13. This obsession was consuming them both. "Maybe," Emily answered carefully, "there are some things that don't add up." That was an understatement. The deeper Emily dug, the more inconsistencies she found. The maintenance log for the Cessna 310 showed it had been inspected the day before Daniel's flight, signed off by a mechanic named Aaron McGill. But when Emily called the maintenance facility to ask follow-up questions, she discovered McGill had left the company 2 weeks earlier. The weather reports in Daniel's flight packet indicated clear conditions along his entire route. But archived meteorological data showed significant downdrafts and turbulence had been forecasted for the exact area where his signal disappeared. Most concerning of all, the flight recorder on Daniel's plane was a newer model, capable of transmitting data packets even if physically damaged. Yet no signals had ever been detected. Emily filed Freedom of Information Act requests, demanding access to the FAA's full investigation records. When the documents finally arrived months later, they were heavily redacted, black lines obscuring key details about the search parameters and findings. It wasn't proof of anything specific, but collectively, these discrepancies painted a picture of something beyond simple tragedy, something deliberate, something hidden. Emily transformed her dining room into a case room, with maps taped to walls and timelines stretching across corkboards. Sophie would sit on the stairs after school, listening to her mother on endless phone calls with investigators, journalists, lawyers, anyone who might help uncover what really happened to Daniel. "The most dangerous part of any cover-up," Emily told Sophie one night, "isn't what they hide. It's what they assume no one will ever look for." Detective Marla Bendix wasn't supposed to get involved with the Reese case. As lead investigator for major crimes in Boulder County, her jurisdiction didn't include aviation accidents or missing persons outside county lines. But something about Emily Reese's quiet determination got under her skin. "I've seen grief take many forms," Bendix would later tell reporters. "What I saw in Emily wasn't just grief, it was the face of someone who knew they were being lied to." Their first meeting occurred 9 months after Daniel's disappearance, when Emily brought her collected evidence to the police station, hoping for official help. Most officers would have gently redirected her to the FAA or NTSB. Bendix didn't. Instead, she stayed 3 hours after her shift ended, reviewing Emily's documents, listening to her theories. By midnight, Bendix had reached a disturbing conclusion. Emily Reese wasn't delusional or desperate. She had identified legitimate inconsistencies that deserved investigation. The problem, Bendix explained, is jurisdiction. I can't officially investigate an aviation incident, but unofficially, she paused, weighing professional caution against moral obligation. Unofficially, I can ask questions. Those questions led Bendix down a rabbit hole that would eventually cost her her career. She began with Aaron McGill, the mechanic whose signature appeared on maintenance documents after he'd left the company. Located in Arizona, where he'd taken a new position with a commercial airline, McGill was initially reluctant to talk. "Look, I don't want trouble," he told Bendix during their first phone call. "I've got a family to support." "I'm not looking to cause trouble," Bendix assured him. "I'm trying to give a family answers." McGill's hesitation spoke volumes. When he finally agreed to meet Bendix at a diner outside Phoenix, his story confirmed Emily's darkest suspicions. "My signature was forged," McGill stated flatly. "I never inspected that plane. I was in Sedona with my wife when that document says I was signing off on the Cessna's electrical system." "Do you know who might have forged it?" Bendix asked. McGill stared into his coffee. "Management pressured maintenance supervisors all the time. Flights had to go out. Schedule had to be maintained. You complained, you got fired. Simple as that." "And Daniel Reese? Did you know him?" McGill's expression shifted, a flash of genuine regret crossing his features. "Yeah, I knew Dan. Good pilot. Too good, maybe. He noticed things others didn't. Filed reports when equipment wasn't right. Made waves. The kind of waves that might make him unpopular with management," Bendix pressed. "The kind of waves that get you assigned to the oldest planes in the fleet," McGill confirmed. "The kind that get you sent on routes other pilots turn down." Back in Colorado, Bendix began assembling a timeline of Daniel's final weeks at Aerosky. She discovered he had filed 3 separate maintenance concerns in the month before his disappearance, all related to the electrical system and autopilot on the company's Cessna fleet. More disturbing, 2 similar model aircraft had experienced unexplained autopilot irregularities in the previous year. Both incidents had been attributed to pilot error, despite the pilot's insistence that the planes had behaved erratically. When Bendix requested the complete maintenance records for these incidents, she hit a wall. Aerosky refused to provide documentation without a court order, citing proprietary information. She began preparing subpoena requests, only to be called into her supervisor's office. Chief Williams was apologetic, but firm. "You need to drop this, Marla. It's outside our jurisdiction, and we're getting pressure from above." "Pressure from who?" Bendix demanded. Williams' expression was answer enough. Aerosky Logistics was one of the county's largest employers, with political connections reaching to the state capitol. "Just let the federal agencies handle it," Williams advised. "That's their job." Bendix left her badge and gun on Williams' desk the next morning. Her resignation letter was simple. "I cannot in good conscience continue to serve in a system where justice is determined by corporate influence rather than fact." She called Emily Reese that same day. "I'm not a detective anymore," she said without preamble. "But I'm not stopping. If anything, I can do more now that I'm not bound by department politics." Emily heard the determination in the former detective's voice. For the first time since Daniel disappeared, she felt something close to hope. "So what's our next step?" she asked. "We follow the pattern," Bendix replied. "Patterns don't lie. People do. Time does strange things to unresolved tragedy. It doesn't heal so much as it calcifies, turning raw wounds into hardened scars that reshape one's entire existence. For the Reese family, the years following Daniel's disappearance became an exercise in learning to live with an absence that never stopped, feeling temporary. Emily continued working as a paramedic, finding purpose in saving others even as she couldn't save her husband. Sophie graduated high school, then college, eventually becoming a journalist, a career choice directly influenced by her family's experience with hidden truths and institutional silence. I learned early that official stories aren't always complete stories, Sophie would later explain in interviews. That shaped everything about how I approach journalism. Marla Bendix, now working as a private investigator, maintained regular contact with the Reeses, sharing new information whenever she uncovered it. But as years passed, those discoveries became rarer. Aerosky Logistics was acquired by a larger corporation in 2011, its records absorbed and scattered across new filing systems. Key personnel moved on to different companies. Witnesses' memories faded. The trail grew cold. Emily never removed Daniel's clothes from their closet. His pilot's license remained in its frame on the wall. His favorite mug still hung on its designated hook in the kitchen. These weren't acts of denial, but of defiance, a refusal to accept closure without truth. Every April 16th, mother and daughter would hike to a ridge overlooking the mountains where Daniel had disappeared. They would bring a thermos of coffee, black, the way he liked it, and sit in silence, watching clouds drift over the peaks. Not a memorial, exactly, more like a ritual of remembrance and recommitment to finding answers. On the 10th anniversary of the disappearance in 2018, local media ran retrospective pieces. Boulder pilot still missing after decade, the headlines read, treating the story as a historical curiosity rather than an ongoing mystery. The articles mentioned the official conclusion, presumed crashed due to severe weather conditions, without examining the inconsistencies that Emily and Bendix had documented. When Sophie attempted to pitch a more investigative approach to editors at various outlets, she was gently rebuffed. Old news. No new angles. Move on. But Sophie couldn't move on. None of them could. In the kitchen that had once been filled with Daniel's laughter, Emily maintained her evidence wall. Faded newspaper clippings, flight path maps marked with questions, maintenance records with suspicious signatures. What had started as an investigation had evolved into something between shrine and war room. People ask why I can't let it go, Emily confided to Bendix during one of their regular check-ins. They don't understand that it's not about finding peace, it's about finding truth. Bendix nodded, understanding completely. Truth doesn't have an expiration date. By 2022, 14 years after Daniel vanished, even Emily's determination began to waver. Not her belief that something sinister had happened, but her hope that it would ever be proven. Bendix was battling cancer. Sophie had moved to Seattle for a job with a digital news platform. The dining room evidence wall had gathered dust. Maybe this is it, Emily told Sophie during one of their weekly phone calls. Maybe this is all we get. Sophie, now 27, and developing the same quiet strength that had carried her mother through the darkest days, refused to accept that conclusion. Technology changes, Mom. Records that were hidden become accessible. People who stayed silent find reasons to speak. We just need one break. She couldn't have known how prophetic those words would prove to be, or that the break would come from technology that barely existed when her father disappeared. Evan Carvey had no connection to Daniel Reese or the 2008 disappearance that had briefly dominated local news cycles before his family moved to Colorado. A 32-year-old software developer and drone enthusiast, Carvey's interest in the Rocky Mountain wilderness was purely recreational. I was testing a new automated mapping program, he would later explain to investigators. The drone follows pre-programmed grid patterns and stitches the footage together to create 3D terrain models. Nothing fancy, just a hobby project. On June 8, 2025, Carvey hiked to an elevated clearing near Greystone Ridge, approximately 70 miles northwest of Denver. The location offered unobstructed takeoff conditions for his drone, a consumer-grade quadcopter equipped with a high-resolution camera. The weather was perfect. Clear visibility, minimal wind, ideal flying conditions. Carvey launched the drone, watching through his controller screen as it rose above the tree line and began its automated flight path. For 40 minutes, everything proceeded normally. The drone methodically captured footage of the forest canopy, recording trees, rock formations, and the occasional clearing. Carvey monitored its battery life, preparing to recall the aircraft when it dropped below 30% power. Then something unusual appeared on his screen, a metallic reflection among the endless green of pine trees. The glint was so out of place in the natural environment that Carvey initially assumed it was a camera artifact or lens flare. He paused the automated sequence, taking manual control to investigate further. Guiding the drone lower, he hovered over what was unmistakably human-made, the weathered fuselage of an aircraft half concealed by 17 years of forest growth. The white paint was faded and peeling, but still visible against the dark forest floor. One wing had separated from the body, while the other remained attached at an unnatural angle. "I knew immediately it was a crash site," Carvey recalled. "What I didn't know was whether it was already documented or not." He recorded several minutes of detailed footage, capturing the wreckage from multiple angles before his drone's battery warning forced him to return to his launch site. That evening, reviewing the footage on his laptop, Carvey noticed something that sent a chill through him. Partial lettering visible on the aircraft's tail. A quick internet search for Missing Planes, Colorado brought up several cases, including Flight 908B. The registration number visible in his footage, N38DK, matched the missing Cessna 310. Carvey reported his discovery to the Boulder County Sheriff's Department the next morning, providing them with the coordinates and video evidence. Sheriff's deputies, recognizing the potential significance, immediately forwarded the information to the FAA and NTSB. Within hours, news of the discovery exploded across local media. By nightfall, it had reached national networks. The headlines were variations on a theme: "Missing plane found after 17 years." "Drone enthusiast discovers 2008 crash site." "Technology solves decades-old aviation mystery." What the headlines didn't capture was the human impact, the way Emily Reese's phone began ringing incessantly as friends, neighbors, and reporters all tried to reach her simultaneously. How Sophie, seeing the news alert on her phone during a meeting in Seattle, had to excuse herself to vomit in the office bathroom. How Marla Bendix, now in hospice care, asked a nurse to help her make one final phone call to the family she had never stopped trying to help. The discovery wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of the real investigation, one that would finally expose the truth that had been buried for 17 years. Reaching the crash site proved challenging, even with precise coordinates. The wreckage lay in a steep-sided valley accessible only by helicopter, surrounded by dense forest that had grown around and through the aircraft remains over nearly 2 decades. The recovery operation began 3 days after Carvey's discovery. 2 NTSB investigators, accompanied by FBI evidence specialists and a forensic anthropologist, were lowered to the site by cable from a hovering helicopter. What they found defied the standard patterns of mountain crashes. In most cases, high-speed impact with terrain is catastrophic. Lead investigator Robert Chen would later testify. Aircraft break apart violently. Debris scatters widely. What we found with Flight 908B was different. The evidence suggested a controlled descent, or at least an attempt at one. The Cessna had come to rest in a small clearing, its fuselage largely intact despite significant damage. The landing gear had been deployed. Flaps were extended to landing position. These were not the configurations of an aircraft in free fall or spiraling out of control. "Captain Reese appears to have been attempting an emergency landing," Chen concluded. "He almost succeeded." Most significant of all, the cockpit remained sealed, protected from 17 years of exposure to the elements. Inside, investigators found Daniel Reese's remains still strapped into the pilot's seat. And beside him, preserved in a waterproof case designed for aviation documents, they found his logbook. The final entry, written in Daniel's clear handwriting and time-stamped 6 minutes before. Estimated impact read simply, static growing, system override, autopilot behaving strangely, manual control limited, attempting emergency landing. Those 12 words, preserved by chance and foresight, would become the key to understanding what had happened on that April morning in 2008. They weren't just a pilot's final observations. They were an accusation from beyond the grave. The investigation team also recovered the aircraft's flight recorder, the black box, that had mysteriously failed to transmit emergency signals after the crash. Its physical examination revealed why. The transmitter had been deliberately disabled, its antenna connection severed. This wasn't component failure. It was sabotage. When the news reached Emily Reese, she experienced a complex wave of emotions. Vindication that her suspicions had been justified, fresh grief at the confirmation of Daniel's death, and renewed anger at the forces that had conspired to hide the truth. "I always knew," she told Sophie as they held each other, tears flowing freely for the first time in years. "I always knew it wasn't an accident." Sophie, now a journalist, with the investigative instincts her years of family trauma had honed to a razor edge, immediately recognized the story's significance beyond their personal closure. "This isn't just about Dad anymore," she said, wiping her eyes. "If they covered this up, how many other accidents weren't accidents at all? How many other families are living with lies?" As Emily nodded, Sophie continued, her voice gaining strength. "I'm going to find out who did this. I'm going to make sure everyone knows." What neither of them could have anticipated was how quickly the carefully constructed narrative around Daniel's disappearance would unravel once the first thread was pulled, or how high the conspiracy reached. The most damning evidence came from the Cessna's recovered flight recorder. FBI forensic analysts, using techniques developed for data recovery from damaged devices, extracted information that should have been impossible to retrieve, including evidence of tampering. The data revealed a disturbing sequence of events in the minutes before Daniel lost contact with air traffic control. At 9:10 a.m., 3 minutes before his transponder went silent, the aircraft's electrical system experienced an unexplained power surge. This wasn't a random failure. The surge patterns matched exactly those of a remote override system, technology designed for security purposes that could take control of an aircraft from the ground in case of hijacking. At 9:11 a.m., Daniel attempted to disengage the autopilot. The system initially responded, then reactivated on its own. At 9:12 a.m., cockpit voice recordings captured Daniel's growing concern. "Denver Control, this is Aerosky 908B. I'm experiencing some unusual autopilot behavior. Request immediate assistance." No response was recorded from Denver Control. At 9:13 a.m., all communications and tracking systems went offline simultaneously, an impossibility in a random failure scenario where systems would fail sequentially. The flight recorder continued operating for another 16 minutes, documenting Daniel's increasingly desperate attempts to regain control of the aircraft as it diverged from its approved flight path, descending toward the mountainous terrain where it would ultimately crash. "He fought until the very end," Robert Chen told reporters. "The evidence shows Captain Reese did everything humanly possible to land that plane safely." But the most shocking discovery was found in the recorder's metadata, digital timestamps showing that portions of the data had been accessed and modified after the crash. The modification signature was traced to a third-party maintenance contractor that had dissolved mysteriously 2 years after Daniel disappeared. When FBI agents dug into the contractor's corporate records, they found it had been a shell company owned through a complex network of subsidiaries by none other than Aerosky Logistics itself. The implications were staggering. Someone had not only caused the crash remotely, but had then accessed the recorder data afterward to hide evidence of their actions. This wasn't mere negligence. It was deliberate, premeditated murder. Sophie Reese, leveraging her position as a journalist, obtained copies of the FBI's preliminary findings through a source inside the investigation. Working with editors at her digital news platform, she prepared a comprehensive exposé detailing not just what had happened to her father, but the corporate cover-up that followed. The article, titled "Signal Loss: The Pilot Who Never Came Home," was published simultaneously across multiple platforms on July 22, 2025. It included Daniel's recovered logbook entries, forensic analyses of the flight recorder data, and interviews with former Aerosky employees who confirmed the company's history of safety violations and retribution against whistleblowers. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, Aerosky's stock plummeted. By the following day, the FBI had executed search warrants at the company's headquarters and the homes of several former executives. For Emily, watching the story unfold from the home she had maintained as a shrine to Daniel's memory for 17 years, the public vindication brought little comfort. Justice, arriving so late, felt hollow. "They took everything from us," she told Marla Bendix during what would prove to be their final conversation before the former detective succumbed to her illness. "All these years, all this pain, when they knew. They always knew." Bendix, her voice weakened by disease but her mind still sharp, offered what comfort she could. "But they didn't win, Emily. They thought they buried the truth for good. They never counted on you being stronger than their lies." As federal investigations intensified, the full scope of the conspiracy began to emerge. A corporate horror story of profit, power, and callous disregard for human life. In 2008, Aerosky Logistics had been on the verge of securing a lucrative federal contract worth millions. The deal would have transformed the regional cargo carrier into a major player in government transport. There was just one problem: the company's aging fleet and spotty maintenance record. Several pilots, including Daniel Reese, had filed official reports documenting safety concerns. These reports, if made public, would have disqualified Aerosky from federal consideration. The company faced a choice: address the safety issues at significant cost, or ensure the complaints never reached regulatory authorities. They chose the latter. Internal emails recovered during the FBI investigation revealed a systematic effort to silence whistleblowers through intimidation, reassignment to undesirable routes, and fabricated performance issues. Daniel, as one of the most vocal critics, had been specifically targeted. The most incriminating document was an email from former Chief Operations Officer Thomas Weldon to the head of maintenance, dated just 3 days before Daniel's final flight. Reese continues to be a problem. His latest maintenance report could sink the federal deal if it reaches the FAA. Schedule him for the Spokane run on the C-310. We'll handle the maintenance sign-off internally. After that, we'll discuss permanent solutions to the Reese situation. Permanent solutions. The phrase, so bureaucratic in its bloodlessness, exposed the calculation behind what had initially appeared to be a tragic accident. Further investigation revealed that the Cessna assigned to Daniel had been equipped with an unauthorized remote override system, technology that was supposed to be used only in military and high-security government aircraft. This system, when activated, could take control of the plane's navigation and communication systems from a ground station. On April 16, 2008, someone had used that system to seize control of Flight 908B, disable its communications, and direct it toward terrain where it would crash in a remote area unlikely to be discovered. The mountain location was so isolated that even with specific coordinates, recovery teams struggled to reach it 17 years later. The conspiracy extended beyond the initial crash. Evidence showed that a specialized team had been deployed to the crash site within days of Daniel's disappearance, not to rescue, but to retrieve and tamper with the flight recorder data, erasing evidence of remote interference. When Sophie's article exposed these findings, public outrage was immediate. Congressional hearings were scheduled. Class action lawsuits were filed on behalf of families who had lost loved ones in other accidents involving Aerosky aircraft. Former employees came forward with additional evidence of safety violations and corporate intimidation. The most damning testimony came from Aaron McGill, the mechanic whose signature had been forged on Daniel's maintenance documents. Now in his 60s and battling terminal cancer, McGill had nothing left to lose. "I knew something was wrong when I heard about Reese's disappearance," he told the congressional committee. "I was supposed to have inspected that plane, but I was hundreds of miles away when it supposedly happened. When I tried to report the forgery, my supervisor made it clear what would happen to me and my family if I didn't keep quiet." McGill's testimony, combined with the forensic evidence and recovered documents, led to federal indictments against 7 former Aerosky executives, including Thomas Weldon. The charges included conspiracy, fraud, obstruction of justice, and second-degree murder. For the Reese family, the indictments represented a bittersweet victory. No prosecution could bring Daniel back or restore the 17 years that had been stolen from them. But the truth, the validation of Emily's unrelenting pursuit of answers, offered a measure of peace that had eluded them for nearly 2 decades. "My father wasn't just a victim of corporate negligence," Sophie told reporters outside the federal courthouse after the indictments were announced. "He was targeted for doing exactly what pilots are trained to do, putting safety above all else." His story isn't just a tragedy. It's a warning about what happens when we allow profit to matter more than people. On a clear autumn day in 2025, Emily and Sophie Reese made the journey that had been 17 years in the making. With special permission from authorities, they were flown by helicopter to the crash site where Daniel's remains had been recovered months earlier. The site had been cleared of wreckage, the investigation long complete. What remained was a small clearing among the pines, nature already beginning to reclaim the space where metal had torn through trees nearly 2 decades before. Emily carried a small brass urn containing Daniel's ashes. After a formal funeral attended by hundreds, many of whom had never met Daniel but had been moved by his story, mother and daughter had reserved this final private moment for themselves alone. "He loved these mountains," Emily said quietly as they stood together at the edge of the clearing. "Even knowing what happened here, I can understand why. There's a peace to this place." Sophie nodded, taking her mother's hand. At 30, she had now lived longer without her father than with him. Yet his absence had shaped her life as powerfully as his presence might have, forming her into a woman determined to uncover truth, no matter how deeply buried. "I keep thinking about his last moments," Sophie said, "fighting to control the plane, knowing something was terribly wrong. He must have been so afraid." Emily shook her head slowly. "Your father wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of failing. I think what would have haunted him most wasn't his own death, but the thought that no one would ever know what really happened, that the people responsible would never be held accountable." "Then he can rest now," Sophie said. "Everyone knows. Everyone remembers." Together they scattered Daniel's ashes across the clearing, watching as the mountain breeze carried the fine gray powder up toward the sky he had loved, the sky that had claimed him. As they prepared to leave, Emily placed a small bronze plaque against a nearby pine tree. Unlike traditional memorials with birth and death dates, this one bore a simple message: Cap Daniel James Reese. The truth was never lost, only waiting to be found. The helicopter returned them to Boulder as sunset painted the mountain ranges in gold and crimson. Neither spoke during the flight, each lost in private thoughts and memories. That evening, in the home that had been both shrine and investigation headquarters for 17 years, Emily began taking down the evidence wall in the dining room. The maps, the timelines, the photographs, each piece carefully removed and placed in archive boxes, not discarded, but properly preserved. History rather than obsession. "What will you do now?" Sophie asked, helping her mother catalog the documents that had consumed so much of their lives. Emily paused, a faded photograph of Daniel in her hands. In it, he stood beside his plane, smiling with the easy confidence that had made him such a natural pilot. She traced his face with one finger before carefully placing the photo in the box. "Live," she said simply. "Really live. For the first time since we lost him." I think that's what he'd want. As night fell over the mountains that had kept Daniel's secret for so many years, the lights in the Reese home burned warm and steady. Not the harsh, desperate illumination of an investigation headquarters, but the gentle glow of a home where truth had finally replaced uncertainty. The mountains don't keep secrets. They keep evidence. All we have to do is look up. The federal trials of the Aerosky executives extended into 2027, each conviction adding another layer of validation to what Emily Reese had known in her heart since that April morning in 2008. Thomas Weldon, the architect of the conspiracy that had taken Daniel's life, received a 40-year sentence, effectively a life term for the 73-year-old former executive. The investigation sparked by Daniel's case led to sweeping reforms in aviation safety regulations, including stricter oversight of maintenance records and new protocols for investigating signal loss. The Reese Act, signed into law in 2028, established criminal penalties for corporate officers who knowingly concealed safety violations resulting in death. For Emily, life gradually found a new rhythm. She retired from her paramedic position and began volunteering with an organization supporting families of aviation accident victims, using her hard-won experience to guide others through the labyrinth of grief and bureaucracy. Sophie's journalistic career flourished, her exposé on her father's case winning a Pulitzer Prize and establishing her as a leading voice in investigative reporting. She specialized in corporate accountability stories, uncovering patterns of misconduct that might otherwise have remained hidden. Marla Bendix didn't live to see the full resolution of the case she had sacrificed her career to pursue. She died in hospice care just weeks after the crash site was discovered, but not before Emily and Sophie could thank her for her unwavering support during the darkest years. In her final conscious moments, Bendix had smiled weakly and whispered, "Patterns don't lie. People do. Remember that." On the 5th anniversary of the discovery, Evan Carvey, the drone operator whose hobby had unknowingly changed so many lives, received a surprising invitation from Emily and Sophie. They asked him to join them for their annual hike to the ridge, overlooking the mountains where Daniel had been found. "I've never felt right about accepting credit," Carvey admitted as they reached the viewpoint. "It was just luck that my drone passed over that spot." "Maybe," Sophie replied, gazing out at the vast wilderness. "Or maybe there are forces at work we don't understand. Technology that sees what human eyes miss. Truth, finding its way to the surface no matter how long it takes." The three stood in silence, watching clouds drift over peaks that had witnessed both tragedy and revelation. Below them, the forest continued its slow reclamation of the small clearing where Flight 908B had come to rest. Nature's patient persistence erasing human intrusion one season at a time. Emily closed her eyes, feeling the mountain breeze against her face. For the first time since Daniel disappeared, she could feel his presence without pain, a memory transformed from wound to strength. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "the most important warning sign is the one we see too late, the pattern that only becomes clear in retrospect. But that doesn't mean we should stop looking." As they descended the trail, the setting sun cast long shadows across the landscape. In the distance, a small drone, one of hundreds now used by Forest Services to monitor remote areas, glided silently over the canopy, its camera capturing images of a world too vast for human eyes alone to survey. Technology evolves, secrets erode, truth emerges, and sometimes what was lost is finally found.